you now already know what you look at the unit level variables, right? When I talk about a unit variable, I'm talking about the state itself. So an analysis of foreign policy or international politics that looks at unit level variables, what do we call them? What is the label that Kenneth Waltz have used for them? How did he differentiate between different theories? Reductionist, okay? Reductionist. And reductionist theories focus on unit level variables, meaning they focus on the leader or state, political regime, what have you. Systemic variables, which what neorealism looks at, is specific in its focus with respect to the existing balance of power at any given period of time. And we already discussed this on Thursday. From a Waltzian perspective, let's say, what does the balance of power actually replace? Okay, for Kenneth Waltz, in the absence of central authority, it's the balance of power that acts as the central authority. What does it do? It brings rules into the structure and changes cost-benefit analysis of the individual states. So, distribution of power at any given period of time. How do you assess or understand, see distribution of power, or what kind of distribution of powers exist in any international system? We actually have another systemic theorist, Morton Kaplan. You don't necessarily hear him that much, but he was one of the first people, I'd say, who differentiated between different international systems based on distribution of power. So Kaplan, for example, said when you have an equal distribution of power, you have a balance of power system, right, which in and of itself actually is very hard to define. So for Morton Kaplan, balance of power meant a relatively equal distribution of power between 5 to 6 great powers. Now, this is actually only one definition of balance of power. Okay? Any distribution of power, you would have basically a label that we can actually say is a balance of power, but Kaplan's balance of power is an equal distribution of power between 4, 5, 6 great players at any given period of time, where each and every one of them would possess a similar amount of military capabilities. So any propensity to war between these 4 to 5 players would require other players to balance them as well. So what do you think Kaplan's balance of power actually equals to when we think about the empirical world, when you think about real life situations? Do we have any period in history where Kaplan's balance of power actually has been realized? Can you think of any time in history where there is 5 to 6 great powers which have more or less an equal distribution of power between them, and that in return enabled a certain equilibrium to emerge, and war between them became less likely? When would be the only time when you actually know and see the existence of 5 to 6 great powers that have an equal distribution of power between them? Multipolarity of 1814 to 1914, okay, or you can say 1815 to 1914. This is the era. What would be the label, for example, Mearsheimer or Kenneth Waltz would use? Okay, what Kaplan calls balance of power. What is Mearsheimer that you learned last year, and Waltz that you're reading currently? What would be the label, the term he would use? What is the Waltzian term for this? Right? Remember, we discussed about Waltz. We said there would be, certain types of power that Waltz refers to: unipolarity, bipolarity, multipolarity. Waltzian multipolarity is Kaplan's balance of power. What is the differentiating element? You have 5 to 6 great powers, right? 1814 to 1914. What do we have? Céline came close to that when she said World War I. What do we have? We have, well, that's precisely why World War I never occurred. We have UK, France, Prussia, Russia, Austria, Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire entering into that as well. So you end up actually seeing a system where there are, I'm taking attendance now, okay? Sen yazmaya başla. What we have in that case is in more or less equal distribution of power between 5 to 6 states. According to Kaplan, you have a balance, right? And this balance in return prevents the possibility of a great power war, okay? This is a system that emerged as a result of what? Do you remember why this multipolarity system, or the balance of power that in Kaplan's words emerged? What is it response to? Exactly. Now, if you remember, we discussed there is a pendulum in international relations between two different types of state systems: hegemonic state system and an independent state system. An independent state system is what you have after the Peace of Westphalia, with sovereign states more or less shaping their own policies on their own. An hegemonic state system is when you have a preponderant power, as we discussed last week, and the preponderant power would have the capacity to control the world's resources, the world's markets. It would have the highest level of military capabilities, what have you. And you always see, at any given period of time, states with hegemonic aspirations. Napoleon is a very good illustration of that. France, under Napoleon, had an hegemonic aspiration, and it tried to basically recreate a system that would replace the independent state system. That's the most important aspect of Napoleon. When Napoleon invaded Austria-Hungary, okay, Italy, which was not Italy then, all the Belgian duchies, all the German small kingdoms, okay, what Napoleon did was actually a violation of the Westphalian order, which is a violation of a state's territorial integrity and a complete annexation of that state and assimilation, absorption of that previously existing state into the French Empire, and saying Austria exists no more, Prussia exists no more, and they're all integral parts of the French Empire. So Napoleon, or any state that has an hegemonic aspiration, okay, has the actions, or commits to certain actions that would act as a violation of sovereignty. Now, why is sovereignty a critical element? It is the main defining element of the state system. So sovereignty, or the Westphalian principle, okay, that you shall respect each other's capacity to make individual rules, laws, and you will not violate their rights, is also an ordering principle or a basic rule of the system. So when an hegemonic leader arises and violates Westphalia, you end up with a violation of the very rule on which the independent state system is established, okay? So hegemonic leaders always are met with resistance by other powers, okay? So one of the things that you have in neorealism, okay, or in systemic analysis under realist paradigm, is how to respond and handle hegemonic leaders or hegemonic aspirations, okay? What is the word Argonsky uses for a country with hegemonic aspirations? if you remember Organski, okay, what were the two terms Organski used? Challenger versus defender. Çocuklar, how many of you were planning to do international studies? Do you think that's a good choice? Or social and political studies, SPS? How many of you are planning to do SPS? Do you think that's a good choice? Okay, fine. Organski talks about one of the things. Aytencim, can you cut for a second? Fine. So, Organski's challenger versus defender. This is precisely the same logic that we have in the theories that looks into this pendulum between hegemon and independent state system. So Organski says, can your defender be an hegemon? Yes. You would have, for example, let's say USA and the European Union, right? What did they do after 1945? They actually built an international system with specific rules. You have free trade as a rule, or relative free trade. You have the Bretton Woods system, right? International financial stability through the IMF and the World Bank, right? Do you know I have 3 students working in the World Bank who actually were taking this class 5 to 6 years ago? OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, and of course, the very central player in international politics, NATO. So, US and the European Union, in perspective of neorealism, yeah, tells you that these two players, the transatlantic players to be specific, are together the hegemonic leaders in international system. What is it they do? They set the rules, okay? This is critical. There are rules at any given period of time. Of course, there is an overarching, rule that encompasses everything, that sovereignty and anarchy is the differentiating factor behind all of that. So these, of course, don't change from one system to the other as long as you have a discussion of international politics. Anarchy is given, okay? And within an anarchical system, after 1648, the ordering principle has become the sovereignty principle, okay? States not recognizing a higher authority of their own. Now, these are the differentiating elements, the ordering principles. But then, at any given period of time, within that, which would be common from one system to the other. So anarchy and sovereignty are the ordering principles and differentiating factors from 1814 to 1914. Yes, in the period of multipolarity, which Kaplan uses the word balance of power. Okay? Still, the same anarchical sovereign order would be the ordering principle, the main differentiating factor in the bipolar world from 1945 to 1989. But then, within the two different systems, you can use the word systems there, precisely because there is a different type of distribution of power, okay, there would be different rules of the system. Okay? So rules would change. How would these rules emerge and how would they change? From a neorealist perspective, it's very simple. Okay? Rules are shaped, maintained through whichever is the hegemonic leader at any given period of time. Okay? So under the French hegemonic leadership, okay, you would have a unipolar moment in history where France, you can also say 1815, I usually choose 1814, France acts as a unipolar player. Okay? So what does Napoleon do? Napoleon, for example, introduces into all of the European continent that he conquers the Napoleonic Code. Okay? He develops a bureaucratic system, and then he forces all the other European countries, basically, to adopt that. Okay? That's a rule in the system. Okay? That's a rule in the system. Napoleon introduces a new rule, okay, by, of course, violating sovereignty at the same time. When you come to 1814, okay, with the defeat of Napoleon, the final defeat comes actually in 1815, you have an attempt, okay, by the other countries through the concert of Europe, which starts with the Congress of Vienna in 1815, new rules inserted into the system. Okay? Now, who shapes these rules in the Congress of Vienna in 1815? Okay? The 5 great players at the time: Prussia, Russia, Austria-Hungary, United Kingdom. Okay? 4. France is also invited because France is one of the great powers. So France, 5 states, okay? Russia, Prussia, Austria-Hungary, UK, France. They all sit around the table, 5 of them, and they say, well, we will, our basic aim in this Congress of Vienna is to prevent precisely the rise of somebody like Napoleon, who would have hegemonic aspirations and threaten the independent state system. From 1793 to 1814, this is precisely what happened. Okay? Now, Napoleon at the time, you could think of, from Organski's point of view, okay, as a challenger. Right? What is he challenging? He is challenging sovereignty principle. Okay? He's trying to create a new French empire. Okay? So Organski, Kaplan, Waltz, these are your neorealists, okay, who all define international politics, or who all analyze international politics from one specific angle: distribution of power, the basic rules in the system, okay, the differentiating ordering principles, plus the tendency to go back and forth from an hegemonic order back to the independent state system. The independent state system is the core of the Westphalian order. Okay? So when you think of, for example, these arguments beyond Westphalia, right? These are all about what kind of a system might be emerging that would change the rules of the Westphalian order, specifically sovereignty. So Kaplan says balance of power is more or less equal distribution of power. An equal distribution of power here implies more or less an equal distribution of, measurable capabilities, okay? Military capabilities. France has a large standing army. So does Russia. Okay? So does Prussia. How does United Kingdom more or less balance the French, Prussian, and Russian armies? Through its naval power, precisely. Okay? So they have more or less an equal distribution of power between them. So, first and foremost, okay, according to Kaplan, which Waltz and Mearsheimer does not necessarily agree, according to Kaplan, when you have 5 to 6 great players with more or less equal distribution of power, propensity of war between them will decline. Okay? So Kaplan says balance of power as defined as such will decrease propensity of war. Now, keep also in mind, balance of power as a term is very much flexible. Okay? So when I talk about balance of power, depending upon which specific international relations theory you're looking at, I might be meaning equal distribution of power between 5 to 6 players. Okay? I might be meaning, okay, an equal distribution of power between 2 different poles. I might be meaning a unipolar structure. Okay? I might be meaning, actually, through the word balance of power, any form of distribution of power. Okay? So balance of power has multiple definitions in the literature. Okay? So that's the reason why you have to be clearer in, for example, your analysis if you're looking at international politics from Kaplan's point of view. The balance of power that Kaplan talks about is equal distribution of power between multiple players, okay, 5 to 6, okay? But from, let's say, Mearsheimer, which is also a balance of power, of course, the term he would use for that is not directly balance of power, but multipolarity, where you have, you know, more than 3 players, okay? More than, in any given period of time, you have more than 3 players, you will have multipolarity, okay? So for somebody like Mearsheimer or Waltz, multipolarity might be problematic. I already told you this in the sense that the greater the number of factors, the higher the propensity to miscalculate. Exactly. Okay? So the higher the number of factors, the higher the number of great powers, the higher the propensity to miscalculate, the more likely would the more likelier a war. Okay? So neorealists among themselves, okay? We already discussed this. Neorealists among themselves, even though they agree, okay? So if I bring in Mearsheimer, Kaplan, Waltz, Organski, they would agree that the way to understand how you have a systemic tendency in any given international system towards some form of equilibrium passes through distribution of power. Okay? So all of these guys would agree that if you want to understand Turkish foreign policy, you have to look at distribution of power at that precise moment that you want to understand Turkish foreign policy. You want to understand American foreign policy or the American response to Cuban Missile Crisis. At that precise moment, in 1962, you have to look at the distribution of power there. Okay? The other factors, unit level variables, okay? Leader, political regime, states, you know, geographical location, okay? They would matter in comparison much, much less. Okay? So neorealists, they say you want to understand how the US responds to 9/11. Okay? How Turkey responds to the Syrian crisis, how and why Russia vetoes a UN intervention to Syria within the United Nations Security Council. All of these could only be understood through the distribution of power at that given period of time. This is your overarching reason. That's your main cause. Okay? But then neorealists disagree among themselves as to what kind of distribution of power is more conducive to international stability. Okay? So I mentioned this on Thursday. So Kaplan will tell you equal distribution of power between 5 to 6 great players is the most stable system. Okay? Because these countries would have among themselves, they would form alliances. Okay? So alliances of 2 to 3, which is exactly what happened towards the end of the balance of power century in 1914. You see UK, France, Russia entering an alliance, Germany, Austria, Hungary entering into an alliance. Now, what do alliances do? They basically signal to the potential aggressors that they have more to lose than material gains if they attack a certain country. Okay? Napoleon, when it was doing its conquest of Europe in the 1793-1814 period, when it marched into Prussia, let's say, Prussia didn't have any allies. Okay? So for Napoleon, the only country he was about to fight and defeat was only Prussia. But if Prussia had a formal, okay, and this is also important here, if Prussia had a formal alliance with Russia, okay, it would actually tell Napoleon that Prussia is not alone, and if Napoleon wants the conquest, completely conquer and annex Prussia, it would also have to fight with Russia. Okay? That would then increase the possible costs of the war. It would not eliminate completely the probability, but because it would increase the costs of war, okay, and that's a very important concern because our starting point in neorealism is rationalism, precisely because it would increase the costs of war, Napoleon might have think twice. Okay? So as long as the cost of a certain action, okay, what you calculate, are less than the possible benefits, okay, then you would do that action. So Napoleon looked around, saw no formal alliances, no army with the capacity to challenge at least Napoleon's power in that time period. So he calculated that material benefits of annexing Austria, material benefits of annexing Prussia, material benefits of controlling all Mitteleuropa exceed the possible material costs. What are the costs? Human life. Well, there are lots of people that he just marched into the battleground. And the economic costs of war. But he thought the spoils of war, what he would win as a result, would exceed the costs. Now, if there were formal alliances, okay, and that's the whole reasoning behind Congress of Vienna in 1815. If there were formal alliances in 1793, then Napoleon would have to consider a third variable. Okay? What would happen if I invade Prussia, and instead of only the Prussian army, I also have to fight the Russian and Austrian army? Okay? So the costs of war would increase if Napoleon faced a formal alliance. So when Napoleon was defeated in 1814-15, this was precisely the main logic behind the Concert of Europe. Okay? Let's bring all of the major players together. Okay? First, create a forum of dialogue, debate among them, but also open the road to the formation of formal alliances. So through the shifting of alliances, no one state could stand alone and vulnerable to another great power's military hegemonic aspirations. So within that system, 1814-1914 is an international system. Okay? You can define it as a multipolar system, like Mearsheimer. You can define it as a balance of power, like Kaplan. Okay? Nonetheless, the essence remains the same. There is an equal distribution of power between 5 to 6 great players whose disappearance, okay? That's a basic rule in this system. You don't eliminate one of the 5 to 6 great powers, okay? So even if France is defeated at the end of Napoleonic Wars, the balance of power rule here is that you don't eliminate the French, okay? You don't basically wipe out France from the map of Europe. You revert France back to its pre-Napoleonic borders and reintegrate that into the system. So a rule within multipolarity or balance of power a la Kaplan is you don't eliminate one of the great powers. Okay? Their survival is essential to the systemic stability. Okay? So if there is a conflict between two great powers, let's say there is a conflict between Prussia and Russia sometime in the mid-19th century over territorial possessions in Poland. Okay? You would solve that conflict in order to prevent a great power war between Prussia and Russia. You would allow them to take chunks out of Poland. Okay? So Poland, which is in the larger spectrum of power that you remember from last week, where Poland is located here. Okay, let's say Poland is located here. Poland's position in the larger spectrum of power, in this distribution of power, would mean it would be a prey, pawn, okay? Something to be divided between the Russians and the Prussians. Okay? So Russia and Prussia would solve their possible conflict of interest by taking out chunks from Poland over which Poland has no control. Okay? So this is precisely what neorealism tells you. Poland as a state, unit level, cannot control its own fate within the international system, not because of its leader or state, but because of its position here, okay? Because of where it's located in the international spectrum of power. In that sense, realism, specifically neo-realism, becomes a very deterministic IR theory, okay? It tells you that states' actions, Polish survival, okay? Turkish decision to become part of NATO, okay? Turkish position and foreign policy in Cyprus in 1974. None of these are voluntary decisions from neo-realist perspective. They are all determined, okay? Shaped by the location of that state within the international spectrum of power, okay? So you want to understand Poland, 19th century, you have to look at balance of power. You want to understand Poland, 20th century, you have to look at bipolarity, okay? And that lessons, okay, almost totally eliminates, depending on where you look at it, the importance of unit-level variables in shaping foreign policy. Okay, so Kaplan's balance of power and Waltz's and Mearsheimer's multipolarity is more or less the same thing. Okay? They use different terms to define basically an equal distribution of power between 5 to 6 great powers. A very critical rule within that specific system is you do not eliminate one of the great powers. Okay? So the great powers have to survive in order not to change in order not to change the balance. Okay? But within the multipolar system, both Mearsheimer and Waltz and Kaplan says there is a greater propensity for hegemonic aspirations. So what do they mean? Okay? They argue that when you have 5 to 6 great powers, you will, at any given period of time, see one of them acquiring relatively more capabilities. Okay? That's a challenger from organ scheme. Okay? What does the challenger do? So you don't have a challenge from, I don't know, Zambia. Never becomes a challenger. Right? Zimbabwe doesn't become a challenger. Okay? They don't have the power. So the challengers could only come from the great players. Okay? Well, specifically from this perspective. Okay? So Organski's challenger. What is it that the challenger has? The challenger has increased power capabilities, but the challenger has to be unsatisfied with the status quo. Now, perfect illustration again comes in 1914. Okay? Germany under Kaiser Wilhelm II rises in its power capabilities. It has a long century of industrialization from early 19th century onwards. Therefore, it accumulates significant military capabilities, but it enters a world where the previous players, specifically the great powers in this period, okay, because Germany unifies late in time, 1871, they already have basically divided the world among themselves. So Germany is dissatisfied with the status quo. What is the exact dissatisfaction source? Germany wants, territory. Allegiance says Alsace-Lorraine. In Alsace-Lorraine, we have Kohl and Stillman, so Germany wants to control Alsace-Lorraine. Germany wants colonies, precisely. He's dissatisfied. Germany is dissatisfied with the sharing of the world's resources. Okay? You have an exact similar situation in 2012 as well. Okay? So 1914, Germany is dissatisfied with the status quo, i.e. the sharing of resources by the great players at the time, which left Germany with very little. And Germany starts to increase in capabilities. So what do we see? We see, again, similar to Napoleon, an hegemonic aspiration. Okay? So from Waltz and Mearsheimer's perspective. Okay? This is precisely the critical element, or same thing with Organski. When you have an equal distribution of power between 5 to 6 states, the propensity of one of them to rise as a challenger increases. Okay? And the propensity of other players to miscalculate the actions of the country with hegemonic aspirations also increases. So Mearsheimer says a multipolar distribution of power, or multipolarity as a system, is more conducive to war than, let's say, a strict bipolarity. Why? Because you have a higher probability of a hegemonic player to rise. Okay? If you have more than 2 players, if you have 3, 4, 5, 6, one of them might rise as a challenger. Okay? Now, Organski, or power transition theory, it's the same thing as well that we discussed last week, tells you precisely this, okay? That when you have a power which has a significant increase in its capabilities, okay? Germany builds naval power in 1914, able to challenge the British naval power, the source of Britain's capability in the 19th century. Germany is dissatisfied with the status quo. Germany challenges. Okay? Germany challenges the system. Who defends it in 1914? France, UK, to a certain extent, United States. Okay? So the defenders are the existing hegemonic players in the previous round. What matters is, okay, the common point between them is this. The distribution of capabilities, okay? A change in the distribution of capabilities, specifically the distribution of capabilities themselves, cause the war, okay? Not other factors, okay? So bipolarity operates in the same notion, okay? In bipolarity, you have, instead of 5 to 6 players, you have an equal distribution of power between 2 poles, or 2 states. And we have, again, an empirical data for that, the period from 1945 to 1989. Okay? Not everybody agrees in this time framework. Some say the early years of the Cold War is a unipolar moment, precisely because the US has nuclear capabilities. But the catch in a bipolar system is propensity to miscalculate decreases. Okay? But at the same time, okay, there is an behavioral aspect here. The great powers in a bipolar system, the poles, you can use the superpowers, USA and USSR, compete over the allegiance of the smaller players. Okay? So you would actually see a competition here in bipolar order between the 2 poles over the alliance of smaller players. Okay? So USA will try to prevent USSR from controlling, let's say, Turkey. Okay? USA or USSR will try to prevent either one from controlling, let's say, Iran. Okay? So smaller states survive, or middle powers survive, as a result of the competition over them between these 2 poles. Okay? So they all try to basically bring in other players to their sides. So Turkey will survive if it is threatened, let's say, by USSR, by allying with the USA. Okay? Cuba would survive if it is threatened by USA, with allying with the USSR. Okay? So you would see an action, okay, that other states take that are located here. In order to survive, they find themselves in a pattern of competition between the 2 players. Bipolarity, therefore, involves an ongoing competition between the 2 players over the allegiance of smaller states, middle powers, smaller states, what have you. An important characteristic of the bipolar system, specifically from Waltz and Mearsheimer's perspective, is since propensity to miscalculate is lower, and since the possibility of winning a war is also lower, because between the great powers, if you have 5 to 6, and if one of them finds itself without allies at any given period of time, it could be, facing a war from other states. In a bipolar order, you have a mutually assured destruction, basically. If you have two states which have more or less equal distribution of power, neither side would actually win a confrontation with the other. Okay? Especially if you bring in the nuclear element, mutually assured destruction. If for both USA and USSR, the possibility of surviving a war with the other doesn't exist. Okay? The possibility of surviving a war means if the costs are so high that you don't survive the war either, you don't fight. Okay? So war becomes almost impossible, materially impossible, because the possibility of surviving the war doesn't exist in a bipolar system. Okay? Do you follow that? If, for example, USA and USSR are facing one another and both have the capability, what is it that the capability they have? They have nuclear weapons. Same thing with India and Pakistan. It's the same argument. Okay? If nuclear missiles leave the American homeland and are on their way to Soviet Union during the Cold War years, Soviet Union would respond back immediately, and the missiles would just bypass one another over space and destroy the US, destroy the USSR. If both parties are destroyed, why use nuclear weapons? Okay? And this again is a very important factor in neorealism. Nuclear weapons exist because they are non-usable, okay? And they eliminate the probability of war. Right? They eliminate the probability of war between great players who would basically face increased costs of war. And at the same time, if your potential arch enemy has nuclear weapons, as in the case of Pakistan looking at India, then you would also develop nuclear weapons. Okay? Same thing with what is happening in Iran and Israel today in the Middle East. Okay? If one party has nuclear weapons, the other begins to build them in order to increase the costs of war so that war becomes less likely. All ties back to which assumption? Well, all of this ties back to which two assumptions, let's say? Rationality assumption, assumption. Assumption. Assumption is something different. Assumption is the underlying factors over which you build your theories. So Aslanur's balance of power is something you build on the underlying assumption. Rationality assumption and? Exactly, national security assumption. Rationality assumption, protection of your survival and national security assumption. All of this ties back to these two assumptions. Okay, I'll give you a break. Go get coffee, wake up, come back. We have the emergence of bipolar distribution of power in 1945. But what is interesting, again, Tolga. Okay. What is interesting in this structure is, or in this, let's say, system, in the bipolar order from 1945 to 1989, we now have different sets of rules that separated from balance of power of 1814 to 1914. Okay? Specifically, we see the emergence of, as I have written there on the board, the emergence of certain new rules that the most powerful bloc, the US and Europe together, put. Specifically, free trade, the rise of the international financial order, and the rules of, well, collective security through the United Nations. Okay? These are all the new rules. Okay? Now, let me give you one specific illustration. Within the UN, you can think of this as, within the UN, there is, well, United Nations, of course, emerges in 1945. We have a specific rule of collective security. Okay? So that's a rule that comes together with the emergence of the bipolar order. what is collective security? A violation of the Westphalian principle, sovereignty by any player, doesn't have to be an hegemonic leader, will be made collectively by all the players in that specific international system. Okay? So from 1945 up to today, there are very few instances of violation of Westphalia. Okay? So collective security, if a state violates the very founding principle of the international system, okay? The Westphalian ordering principle, it will be made collectively by the whole community, okay? By the whole international community. Okay? Now, in order to enforce that rule, within the UN, we see the emergence of the Security Council. Now, Security Council is, in and of itself, okay, a continuation of the great power politics of the previous period, because you have 15 members within the Security Council, 5 are permanent. Now, the 5 permanent members are the great powers of the previous period, with one exception. You have, yeah. No, France, UK, USSR, United States, and China. Okay, so 5 permanent members. Now, the 5 permanent members of the Security Council have the veto power. You guys know this. Okay, in the last, for example, in the most recent time, you have seen the Russian and the Chinese veto to a UN action on Syria. Okay, now the veto power then is a continuation of the great power politics principle of the previous period in the bipolar order, but at the same time, it constitutes a rule in the system. Some states in the international community, even though we have equality for all, okay, equality for all from the Westphalian order, some states have more privileges. They are more equal than the others. Okay? Now, that's a current rule. Okay, the minute you have an institutional setup with 5 permanent members having the veto power, that's a permanent rule. A similar situation you can see in the IMF. Okay? When the IMF was created in 1944 with the Bretton Woods Conference, the IMF was created in such a way that the powers behind the IMF, which would have the highest number of votes in their hands, would be the United States and the European countries. Okay? So today, 2012, okay, we have certain rules, okay, that have been in place in the bipolar order. 2 examples. Permanent members in the UN, they have the veto power. Voting rights in the IMF, okay, the European countries and the United States has more voting powers. Okay? Now, the balance of power situation, or the distribution of power in 1945, when these 2 institutions were created, were such that United States and European countries, UK, France, later on Germany when it came back, okay, they were the most powerful states at the time, along with, of course, USSR. Okay? But a lot has changed since then. Okay? So the rules that have been created in 1945 corresponded to the distribution of power at the time. Okay? It corresponded to whichever countries had more power. But things don't remain constant. Okay? Bipolar order collapsed in 1989. Okay? Now, bipolarities collapse. How did it happen? How did bipolarity collapse? What happened in 1989? Okay, the Soviet Union began to dismantle. Okay, it became much weaker. Part of the reason for the weakness of the Soviet Union was it could no longer keep up the arms race it had, specifically the nuclear arms race it had with the USA. Okay? So one of the factors, again, that you have in Organski, Kaplan, Waltz, Mearsheimer, when one of the most powerful players start to decline in their capabilities, okay? Military, economic, what have you, okay? It really wouldn't matter if Poland declines in capabilities, okay? Because it's not one of the key decision makers. But if one of the most powerful players began to decline and slowly disappear, the disappearance of one of the great powers leads to what we call a structural transformation, okay? So you have, with the decline in the Soviet power, okay, it could no longer keep up this mutually assured destruction logic, okay, because now the USSR capabilities were, less compared to the United States, and it became obvious in 1989 under Gorbachev that USSR no longer had the economic capabilities to continue military production. So the minute the Soviet weakness was revealed, okay, what happened immediately was the powers here that found themselves, the middle powers here, that found themselves caught between this strict distribution of power, specifically the ones in the Russian orbit, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Czechoslovakia in a smaller fashion, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, which were parts of the Soviet Union, they began to break away from the Soviet Union. Okay? So the first thing that dismantled before the Soviet Union went down was the Warsaw Pact, okay? Which basically formed the very basis of balancing NATO in the Cold War years. So Warsaw Pact dismantled. Central Eastern European countries, which were Soviet satellites, which were states here that found themselves tightly allied with USSR, began to break free. Okay? They began to, in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuanian case, they declared their independence, okay? Because they were part of the Soviet Union. In Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, they basically broke away from the Warsaw Pact and they turned to the Soviet Union and they said, we are no longer bound by the rules of your dominance. Okay? So Soviet Union's complete demise or its own dismantling was more or less finished by 1991. Okay? So 2 years, Soviet Union ceased to exist in 1991, but the process began in 1989. So once bipolarity began to dismantle, okay? Well, not once bipolar. Once Soviet Union began to dismantle, the bipolar distribution of power disappeared, okay? Now, structural transformation, and I told you this on Thursday, means the distribution of power which acts as the central authority in the absence of a world government, okay, which provides information into the system. Once the existing distribution of power that provides a certain information, okay, what does bipolarity do between US and USSR during these years? It tells all the players what the possible consequences of their actions might be if they violate one of the rules, okay, here in the system, okay? So individual players know that they would find themselves caught between USA and USSR. They also have this knowledge that if they invade, let's say, Kuwait, it will be met collectively by the UN, okay? So certainty, okay? Some information that the distribution of power, such as bipolarity, bring into the system, disappears when the system goes through a transformation. So structural transformation creates uncertainty, okay? Therefore, it's no coincidence, okay? Mearsheimer, in 1990, okay, when he looks at whatever is happening in Europe, writes a new article and says, back to the future, right? He basically says the collapse of bipolar world order in 1989, okay, the disappearance of the Soviet Union and the collapse of the world order will mean Europe will confront bigger security risks and Europe will become more unstable and it will go back to the it will go back to Napoleonic years and the uncertainty of the 19th century. Okay? So Back to the Future is, for Europe specifically, from Mearsheimer's perspective, back to 19th century great power rivalry in Europe, where propensity to war in Europe would increase. Okay? So Mearsheimer is saying what made Europe peaceful from 1945 to 1989. Okay? Because Europe is, you have Napoleonic Wars, you have World War I, you have World War II. It has been the seat of all the wars. What has made Europe less prone to war was the bipolarity between USA and USSR and the impossibility of winning a war, the increased material costs of winning a war, therefore the material impossibility of war. Okay? So Mearsheimer says, if it was the international system, bipolar distribution of power that made Europe stable from 1945 to 1989, if you remove that, if you remove the factor that made them stable, if one of the actors, USSR, disappears, they will go back to what they were before World War I. Okay? So all neorealists, more or less, were arguing that the disappearance of bipolarity in 1989 is highly conducive to new wars. It leads to increased uncertainty. Therefore, states find themselves trying to survive in a new world order. Okay? We do this in Turkish foreign policy in exactly the same fashion. 1989 becomes a problem for Turkish foreign policy as well, because Turkey in the Cold War years relied on its place as part of what Ali Can have said in the break, this Western order. Okay? Turkish inclusion into the West, Europe and US-dominated order, was for a very specific reason. That was to have a balance against the Soviet Union. Okay? Turks were incorporated into NATO, OECD, Council of Europe, whatever you want to call them, in the post-1945 period, because Turks had a very clear role, Turkey had a very clear role, which is to deter, to stop Soviets from marching into Western Europe. Okay? Now, if the Soviet threat is removed in 1989, if Soviet Union is no more, there would be no reason to deter the Soviets. If Soviet Union is no more, then why should Turkey be included into the Western order? So suddenly, in 1989, before you guys were even born, we tried to tackle these questions. Okay? Why would Turkey still be part of the West if the main threat to the West is no more? Okay? So that's uncertainty for Turkish foreign policy. So what do? Okay? You find new avenues for yourself that would make Turkey valuable, let's say, to the Western order. But from a theoretical perspective, what matters is this. Turkish foreign policy in 1989 changes. It changes not because of a governmental change, not because of a leader change, but because the international structure changes. Okay? Soviet Union, which made Turkey an integral part of the Western order, the raison d'etre for Turkish inclusion, exists no more. Okay? So international structural transformation requires an adaptation, a change in Turkish foreign policy. Same thing happens in Europe. Okay? Suddenly, the European countries are looking around in 1989, and their most important threat, okay, the Soviet threat on Western Europe, goes. Okay? Now, what made the US and the European countries come together was precisely, and this is neorealism at its height, was precisely this convergence of interests. Okay? This is critical. Okay? Turkey had a convergence of security interests with the USA. Why? They had a common enemy, USSR. USA, Western Europe, had a convergence of security interests. Why? They had a common enemy, Soviet Union. Okay? USA and India had a convergence of interest in the Cold War years. Why? Again, they feared the expansion of communism into Southeast Asia. Okay? Convergence of security interests from neorealism is why you have alliances. Okay? Why you have certain agreements. Okay? Once the factor, okay, that acts as the main reason, as the raison d'etre for that convergence of security interests disappear, okay, then your whole structure would collapse. So if the Soviet Union is the main cause leading to a convergence of security interests between USA, Turkey, between USA, Europe, between USA, Central America, what have you, okay? The minute that factor is gone, there is no reason for the continuation of the alliance because the convergence is no more, okay? So suddenly, Europe faces the same problem, okay? Exactly like Turkey. Europe says, well, the reason why we have the American presence on the European continent militarily, the reason why we have the nuclear bases or the nuclear deterrent on the German soil is because USA feared the rise of Soviet Union. So how can we rely on the continuation of the American presence in Europe if our common threat no longer exists? So the European countries came together, the ones who already have the European Community Agreement, and they decided, yes, one of the things that we can increase certainty, okay, one of the way we can increase information available to us is if we take one more step towards a closer integration, and they signed the Treaty of Maastricht in 1991, creating the European Union and adopting a common foreign security policy. So structural transformation pushes the European countries to further their integration by the Treaty of Maastricht. Okay, so a neorealist will look at Treaty of Maastricht as an outcome of structural transformation. It would look at, a neorealist would look at Iraqi invasion of Kuwait in 1990 as an outcome of structural transformation. A neorealist will tell you that changes in Turkish foreign policy in 1989, okay, this grand design of the Turkic century of the 21st century, okay, to unite all the Turks from the Atlantic to the Urals, okay? That was a Turkish foreign policy objective in 1989. To become more active in the Middle East, to participate in the 1990 Gulf War as part of the UN multilateral force. These are all drastic changes in Turkish foreign policy. Neorealists will tell you that all of these are caused by the structural transformation of the disappearance of the Soviet Union. So you have here a very straightforward analysis. What is your independent variable? Distribution of power. What is your dependent variable? World War II, World War I, Napoleonic Wars, Concert of Vienna, Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, change in Turkish foreign policy in 1989, Maastricht Treaty of 1992. Okay? All of these, okay, are the dependent variables here. Okay? All of these events, okay, all of these occurrences, war, treaty, change in foreign policy, emergence of a new alliance, okay, all of these are outcomes of the distribution of power at that given period of time, or they are outcomes in the structural transformation or systemic changes that happens in the distribution of power. One of the key actors disappear, systemic transformation. A new order emerges with NATO and WTO, with NATO and Warsaw Pact. That's a structural transformation, 1945. So 45 is structural transformation. 89 is structural transformation. 1815, Concert of Europe with the Congress of Vienna, structural transformation. Kaiser Wilhelm's rise to power in 1914 and the eruption of World War I, structural transformation. Neorealists tell you that it is the structure that matters, period. Okay? Now, coming back to my rules. So we have, in the 1945-1989 period, the most dominant bloc, let's say, the one that has the highest military and economic capability is the American and the European bloc, the transatlantic bloc, okay? In 1990, I told you this maybe, in 1990, the transatlantic bloc had, bless you, controlled and created more than 50%, around 55% of the global wealth. Okay? So when you look at the global GDP in 1990, it was 52 to 53% produced by the US and the European countries. Today, in 2012, that's down to 36, 37%. Okay? World population, 19th century. Okay? Something like 35% of the world population was living in Europe, okay, at the time of World War I. Today, when you look at the world population, European population is something like, it's less than 10%. There are 450 million people in Europe, whereas in the whole of the world, how many people do we have? 7 billion, okay? So if you add US and Europe together, it's about 700 million. Okay, so it's about 10% US and Europe combined together, world population. So population dynamics, demographic dynamics, economic dynamics, and military capabilities began to change very rapidly, especially in the last 30 years. Now, so we have currently, what kind of a system would you say that we would have currently? Do we have a bipolar world order? Okay, so there are some people like Ali Can who says we have a unipolar order. Why? The US still has what? US is the hegemon. Now when you look at the world's economies, okay, economic wealth, which country has, which is number one? US. Okay, which is number two? China. What do you think is number three? Germany. Four? No. Four. GDP. I'm actually talking about economic wealth is GDP. So USA has about 14 billion. China has 13 billion. So Chinese GDP has become very close to the US. Germany comes, Germany must be 3. I have the figure somewhere. It's not Russia, okay? No. Norway is not there. Norway is not there at all. Right. Brazil exceeded UK last year. We have France. Okay, India. Okay, must be Russia somewhere. So when you look at the world percentage of the GDP, okay, economic wealth translates, of course, into military capabilities as well, at least in the American and the Chinese case. In 1945, okay, 1945 to 1989, we have what we call the G7, okay? That is the largest economies in the world were meeting in the G7 summit meetings. They are United States, okay, UK, France, Italy, Canada, Japan, one more. What do you think is the 7th one? Did I say Germany? Germany, okay? So US, Canada, UK, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, G7. No? That's your G7. So until 1989, 1990, world economic decisions, okay, think of it like this. All the world's economic decisions were taken by more or less these 7 countries, okay? Because they had the highest share of global wealth, and they were able to actually influence trade flows, okay? International financial system, okay? And they would control the world's resources. G7 transformed into G8 at the end of Cold War with the inclusion of Russia, okay? Now we have the G20, okay? The largest 20 economies in the world. China was not in G7, okay? Brazil was not in G7. India was not in G7, okay? So these were the developing countries of the bipolar order, okay? Now, today, when you look at the first 10 economies in the world, where do you think Turkey is in this link? it's number 16, okay? Now we have Spain somewhere, Italy somewhere. Huh? But it's down. Somebody said Norway. Norway is down here, okay? So it's not there. We're not looking at the per capita income, okay? They're looking at the size of the economy. The size of the economy is measured through the gross domestic product, okay? Turkish gross domestic product. What is Turkish GDP? Do we know? What is GDP, by the way? Exactly. The gross domestic product is the totality of all your industrial, agricultural, services production, okay, and the amount of income that's generated in the country, okay. Per capita income is GDP divided by population, okay, fine. So the size of the economy is what shapes this. The US still is number one, but it's changing because China has rapidly caught up with the US, okay. Turkish GDP is about $800 billion, $800 million. US is 14 billion, 800 billion. Bir dakika, what am I doing wrong? 800 million. 800 billion. And this is trillion probably. So we have a ranking of the world's economies. Now, the thing that I want you to be aware is this. The world's largest economies have changed over time, okay? So China, Brazil, India, Russia, okay, the BRICS, South Africa, Turkey, Indonesia is also there, okay? These are the countries that have moved up, okay? Turkey moved up, okay? And it's moving up. I don't know if you're following this, but one of the goals in 2023 is to bring Turkey into the first 10, okay? And a lot of people are saying this is going to happen, okay? So the first 10 in about 10 to 15 years is going to change. UK was higher up in the ladder, and as Jamal have said, Brazil exceeded UK by 2011, okay? So Brazil is moving up the ranks, and the previous G7 countries are moving down the ranks, okay? So what does this mean, okay? It means the distribution of power, okay, as measured through global wealth is changing, okay? But then there is actually a correlation to that. Are the rules of the system that are shaped by the US and Europe changing in response, okay? Who still holds the veto power in the United Nations, okay? Well, we have China and Russia as part of there, but Brazil does not, okay? Turkey, India does not. Who have, I have erased this unfortunately, voting rights in the IMF, okay? More voting rights in the IMF. UK is a smaller economy compared to Brazil, but UK has more voting weight in the IMF. So the changing distribution of power, okay? And you can think of this as a challenge now, okay? Instead of one challenger, we now have a group of challengers, okay? BRICS, okay? Emerge as a challenger, okay? They want change. They are dissatisfied with the status quo. What is the source of dissatisfaction? The rules of the system that are put together in the post-1945 period no longer reflect the distribution of power that exists currently. So as distribution of power changes in the world, okay, we are actually looking into a structural transformation as well. So it's not only in 1989 we have a structural transformation. Why? Soviet Union collapsed, okay? 2012, we are seeing again a structural transformation. None of the actors have disappeared, okay? So we have all the great powers in place, but there is a differentiation in terms of the ranking of the world's powers. So in your great power spectrum, when India, Brazil, China were down there, Turkey, they are moving up here, okay? But the existing corresponding rules don't acknowledge that. Okay? The existing rules don't correspond, does not reflect, they do not basically correspond the existing distribution of power. So what is happening in the global system today is a very similar change in distribution of power. There is a change in distribution of power. It's not exactly through the disappearance of the Soviet Union like in 1989, but the global balances are changing. As global balances are changing, what do the new group of states want? Okay? There is no one challenger. Okay? So that's the key difference. We don't have Germany of 1914 or a Germany of 1939 asking for an alteration of the system so they would have more territories in Asia, Latin America, Africa, what have you. Okay? We don't have an hegemonically aspiring leader. Okay? China is not trying to become the hegemonic power. Okay? So there is no, in the sense of Napoleon, Kaiser Wilhelm II and Hitler's illustrations of an hegemonic leader rising and basically, disturbing the system. But we still have a systemic transformation. Why? The size of the global economy is changing. The relative share of the previous group, US and Europe, is declining. Okay? 14% decline from 1990 to 2011 is a gigantic decline. Okay? Because they have been, since the 19th century, holding both economic and population power and military power as well. No more, finished. Okay? But when you look at the international organizations, okay? WTO, the United Nations, the IMF, the World Bank, OECD, in all of these global governance tools, institutions of global order, there is a reflection of the power of the US and European countries. And the global governance institutions don't fully incorporate the rising powers position in the international system. So what does Brazil, Turkey demand? You're probably reading what our Prime Minister is saying on this issue. What is Erdogan saying? Exactly. Reform of the Security Council. That's a demand coming from the newly rising states. What is it that they want? What else? So change Security Council, eliminate the veto power. UK, France doesn't count as much as they used to. UK and France are the previous powers of the 19th century. Okay? They are no longer the strongest powers in the world. China has twice the economy of France, 3 times the economy of France. So France cannot balance China in any way. But in the 19th century, France was one of the great powers. It no longer is. But it still has the veto power in the UN. So what do the new challengers want? Change the UN system. Okay? Similarly, change the voting weights in the IMF. Okay? Now, Turkish debt to the IMF is almost finished. Huh? We used to, again, things that you probably would not remember, but Turkey has been rescued by the IMF for a very long time in the 1980s, 1990s. Last one is 2001. Now, Turkey is becoming, instead of a borrowing nation, it's becoming a debtor nation. It's going to give money to the IMF. Okay? So the Turkish government says, well, if I'm going to give my money to the IMF, I'd like to know where it is spent. Okay? I'd like to have more voting power. It's no longer the US that gives the highest amount of financial aid. China bypassed the United States in terms of financial aid to Africa. Okay? So the balances have changed. Is this systemic transformation? Yes. Okay? Where did this systemic transformation come about? It came through 2 things. Through changes in population dynamics. Okay? In the next 10 years, I also said this before, by 2025, okay, 1 out of every 2 people in the world, okay? If we have 7 billion people today, 3.5 billion people in the world will be Asian, precisely, okay? So even in the US, okay, the population dynamics in the US shows that the whites in the US are getting smaller, and the Asian population and the Hispanic population in the US is getting larger. So population dynamics change, economic dynamics change, therefore there is a pressure on the existing distribution of power, right? Now, does it mean that US will have a war with China? We don't know. We don't know. It might come. We don't know. It might, okay? If you're a neorealist, if you're Mearsheimer, okay, or if you're Kenneth Waltz, why not? Right? What is to stop them? Well, China has a nuclear capability. Well, what the Chinese don't demonstrate doesn't necessarily mean they don't have it. We don't know for 100% as to whether they have the same capability. But yes, you're right in the sense that of the, when you look at only the economic wealth, it only reflects one aspect of the picture. And when it comes down to military capability, US has significant capabilities compared to the others, okay? And the US's technological capability, it doesn't need an army. They're now able to shoot people from their own houses in Washington, D.C., okay? There is now a new type of a warfare, which the other countries have not basically caught up with. But for European countries, okay, think, all of the world wars were European in their origin, okay? And this is something very important. Modern state system in the past 400 years has been Eurocentric, okay? Westphalia is signed in Europe, okay? Napoleonic Wars, Europe, okay? World War I, World War II, that brought everybody in, Europe, okay? Europe was the center of the universe, okay? The European countries altogether, UK, France, Germany, but also Italy and Spain, they were among the largest economies in the top 10, okay? Now they're going down. Italy and Spain has already moved down. UK is being demoted down. Germany will probably remain there, but other European countries are moving down, okay? So Europe as a center of the universe is changing, okay? With 450 million people, in terms of population dynamics, it's no longer the case, okay? In terms of share of global wealth, okay, it's gone down, okay? In terms of military capabilities, it has gone down. That's the reason why our government is saying for Europe to count in the world affairs, they should have Turkey in, okay, as a member of the EU. So they're coming down, okay? But in terms of the global institutional structure, Europe still has relatively more voting rights, more representation that no longer reflects the existing distribution of power, okay? So you have a challenge, okay? And the challengers, the BRICS, the Turks, the MISTs, what have you, are demanding not war, okay? So change is coming, but not necessarily through wars, because power transition theory, theory of hegemonic stability, all of these neorealist theories tell you that when you have a challenger, change comes through wars, okay? So challenger rises, declares war, there is an ongoing war, the challenger in that time could become the new hegemon in time t+1, okay? So theory of hegemonic stability and power transition tells you that change in the international system comes through warfare. Seems no longer be the case, right? So there might still be wars, but it no longer seems to be the only path of change, right? So if you are, for example, Barack Obama, okay? If you are Barack Obama, how do you formulate American foreign policy today? You don't need to? Okay, if you are Barack Obama, which part of the world will you start paying attention to? Asia. Okay? So there is actually a very, very clear indication. Obama already said a couple of months ago, United States is a trans-Pacific power. Okay? This is the first time you actually hear this. Previously, American foreign policy all throughout the 20th century revolved around the notion that US is a transatlantic power. Okay? What is the transatlantic? US and Europe. Okay? Now, as the share of Europe in world economy and in world global power declines, US is looking at Asia. Okay? What is happening in Asia? Economic growth, economic dynamism, okay? Population growth. So there will be markets in Asia. There will no longer be markets in Europe. Okay? Who in Greece will buy American products when Greece is bankrupt? You can ask this to Dora on Friday. Okay? So markets are in Asia. Economic growth is in Asia. Plus changing dynamics. India, okay? China, okay? Pakistan, Indonesia. Okay? Indonesia is also among the newly rising states. They are all in Asia. Okay? So there is a shift. It's also no coincidence that the Turkish government has started direct links with Mexico and China. Okay? Turkish Airlines started flying to, you can actually see the power situation by looking at Turkish Airlines flight routes. Yes, definitely. Okay? So they started to fly to Mexico for the first time this year. They started Brazil a couple of years ago, in 2010, I think. And now Turkish government is flying east. Okay? Dubai is becoming the hub. Frankfurt was the major hub. The airport, Frankfurt, was the major hub. Now, Dubai is replacing that. Okay? So there is a lot of action in Dubai, in Abu Dhabi, because that's the route from the west to the east. Okay? That's the reason why there is a third airline being built, by the way. Okay? Because Atatürk Havalimanı no longer suffices for the hub requirements. So we are building a completely different third airline because of this west and east shifting of balances. That's global transformation. Okay? Now, the neorealists tell you, however, that as these power balances, and this is something critical in Mearsheimer, but also you would see it in Waltz as well, which brings us to this question. Okay? Is it possible to see a likelihood of war between China and the US? Okay? There are scenarios. Some of you actually were at the talk we had last year in May with Brzezinski. Did you come to Brzezinski's talk? In May, the Sabancı Award Brookings lecture. Anyway, this is in Brzezinski's book, Strategic Vision. Okay? What is going to happen to the West and what is going to happen to global balances? It's central for global scenarios for the future. A lot of people are predicting now Turkey will be the most powerful player in Europe by about 20-25 years. Okay? It will have more economic and military capabilities than almost all the other European states. Okay? So at some point in time, there are certain people predicting by 2050, for example, US might see a confrontation with Turkey because of the Turkish dominance in Europe. Okay? So multiple scenarios for future transformations. What matters for us from an IR theory perspective is this is precisely what neorealists look at. How distribution of power shapes unit behavior beyond and above the unit level factors. The main explanatory variable, if you want to understand US decision to have China included in WTO, okay, lies in the distribution of power. If you want to understand Russian membership in WTO, Russia is in the first 7. There is something wrong there. If you want to understand, it's not 9, it's above UK and France. If you want to understand the Russian inclusion in WTO, again, it's the distribution of power. Which means then, okay, for a realist perspective, the anarchical world order, okay, that's a given. Okay? We know it's a given. We don't contest this. Within this anarchical world order, the sovereignty / Westphalian principle of the independent state system is the defining, ordering principle. Okay? You cannot change that. But the element to understand, or the factor that rises as the critical element to replace what central governments do in domestic politics, in international politics, is the distribution of power. So in the absence of central authority, in the absence of a world government, balance of power, distribution of power, bipolarity, whatever you call it, emerges as the main mechanism, okay, that would bring information, certainty into the system, changing the cost-benefit analysis of the players and impacting their calculations. Okay? And it all ties back to the rationality assumption. Now, liberalism. Before I switched into liberalism, I actually talk about Joseph Nye. You're reading Joseph Nye from your book as well. In the 70s, okay, we began to see in IR theory a number of people beginning to contest, challenge the realist paradigm. Okay? Now, in the realist paradigm, the notion of power, military capabilities as the critical variable, as we discussed on Tuesday. The contestation, or the first major theoretical falsification, let's say, okay, because you have contestations before, but a significant theoretical challenge does not necessarily emerge until the mid-70s. In 1975, two Harvard professors, Robert Keohane and Joseph Nye, published a book called Power and Interdependence. Okay? Now, in that book, Keohane and Nye argue that the world is not as simple as the realists portray it to be. Okay? Specifically, they argue that the role of security concerns, the constant preoccupation with national survival, and the absolute reliance on military capabilities to realize that is only a small part of the picture. It's only a small part of the international dynamics. And they basically say, as important as military and political concerns, economics play a very important role. Okay? So we see, and this is actually an interesting development, we see from mid-1970s onwards a stress on the importance of economic capabilities as equally important as military capabilities. Okay? So in realist paradigm, economic capabilities, of course, matter because the more, the higher your GDP, the higher your per capita income, the higher your level of industrialization, the more money you can actually pay for your military expenditures. Okay? So the list I have done on Tuesday, the first 10 economies in the world, they also matter from a realist perspective significantly because they give you a notion of what kind of military capabilities these countries would have. So the largest economies almost always have the strongest military capabilities as well, with few exceptions, Japan and Germany. Why Japan and Germany? Why Japan and Germany are the exceptions? Exactly. At the end of World War II, according to their agreements that dictated their surrender, they are basically restrained from developing offensive military capabilities. So all the efforts that Japan could have put into military expenditures, as it did before World War II, Japan began to put on technological innovation and economic progress. So that's also the reason why, by the time you come to 1970s, Japan has become one of the rising economic stars and contests the United States in world economy. And even though the US was the leading technological innovator, major economic player before World War II, precisely because it began to start accumulating its expenditures on military part, its technological innovations began to decline compared to, let's say, Japan. So the surrender terms of 1945. But there is a link, no matter. There is a link from a realist paradigm as well between how much money you possess, what your level of development is, in terms of what your military capabilities are. Now, Kahan and I say, well, military capabilities only give us a portion of power, which is the ability of making other players do as you like them to do. And there are other aspects of power that realism is unable to capture. Okay? So we see with the power of interdependence and the rise of liberal paradigm, a differentiation or a distinction between certain types of power, okay? Specifically between hard and soft power. Some of you have written this in the exam, even though I didn't ask for it, the power and capabilities question. So hard and soft power. Hard power is what the realists emphasize. It's a sum of measurable military capabilities, what countries possess in terms of, let's say, the size of an army, weapons of mass destruction, conventional weapons, the American, let's say, possession of drones right now that no other state has. Hard power is, can you have or can you use and basically utilize the concrete military capabilities that you possess in getting what you want. Okay? So if power is the ability to make other people do certain things, hard power is the instrument that relies on military capabilities. Nye and Kahan says, well, no, it's not exactly the same. It's not exactly how international politics work. We have other instruments that we could call power, but they don't necessarily require, you know, military capabilities. Nye and Kahan call them soft power. Okay? Now, soft power is basically the same thing, you know, it's the ability of a country to make others do certain things, but through other instruments. Turkey have signed the European Convention of Human Rights in 1948, but it had certain reservations on certain protocols. Okay? Protocol 6 is the one on death penalty. Now, what made the Turkish government in 2002 to remove death penalty from Turkish penal code was the soft power of the European Union. Okay? The EU said, we will not start any form of negotiations with you. We will not proceed our relations further as long as you have death penalty in your penal code. Okay? So you can think of it like this. Player A, the Union. Okay? Player B, Turkey. Action, lifting the death penalty. Turkey on its own would not have lifted the death penalty if the European Union did not require it to. Okay? So the EU had power over Turkey to commit a certain action, which is to lift the death penalty from the Turkish penal code. Now, how did the EU do that? Okay? It said, well, I will not negotiate or open negotiations with you, which has significant economic implications, unless you perform that action. Okay? Perfect illustration of soft power. EU uses what we call economic incentives. Okay? It's using economic incentives which will, you know, which Turkey would reap in 2002 and afterwards if it fulfills certain conditions of the EU, even if it doesn't want to, for the sake of longer term economic incentives, Turkey lifts the death penalty. So Joseph and Nye basically argue that in the case of, let's say, American hard power, the United States would have cannot force another state to lift, let's say, death penalty by military force. Okay? But what the US, with its hard power, cannot do, other players, perfect illustration is the European Union, could do with other instruments than military capabilities. What are these other instruments? Economic incentives. Okay? Any kind of an economic incentive. Okay? China wanted to be a WTO member from late 1990s onwards. Okay? The United States turned to China and said, well, you have to improve your human rights situation. unless you release the journalists in custody, unless you do A and B and C, we cannot approve your membership into the WTO. Okay? That's an economic incentive. Okay? So economic and diplomatic together. So China reforms, of course, doesn't completely change, but at least reforms some of its actions in return for the possible promise or the possible inclusion into the WTO. Okay? Iran begins to build nuclear weapons. Okay? The US wants to stop, together with the EU, wants to stop Iran from building nuclear weapons. And they say, well, we will start adopting certain measures that will prevent Iran from exporting its oil and gas into the international markets, and we will prevent Iran from importing from European and American countries certain products that they might need. Okay? On top of that, the American Congress says any company that does business with Iran, Shell, Total, what have you, European companies, cannot do business in the American soil. Okay? These are called economic sanctions. Okay? They're called economic sanctions. So it's two different things here that we're talking about. One is a stick. Okay? Economic sanctions is a stick. You place an economic embargo. Okay? You say any company that does business with X country cannot do so in the Y country. Okay? So you can use sticks. You withhold. When you use economic sticks, you withhold economic benefits. Okay? China cannot be a WTO member unless it reforms its human rights policy. Turkey cannot start negotiations with the EU unless it prohibits death penalty. Okay? That's the other part of the soft power through economics, and those are the carrots. Okay? In that case, you're not withholding something, but you're promising something that would be beneficial to the country in the longer run. So economic tools. Okay? Keohane and I argue that economic tools constitute what we call soft power and are able to bring change in other countries without the need to resort to basically military capabilities. And economic tools have two different aspects. It could be either the possibility of punishment, which is an economic sanction, or the eventual promise of an economic incentive, membership in WTO, for example, or it could be in the, again, in the Turkish and the EU case, or Turkey uses that with other countries around itself as well, the promise of eventual economic incentives. Okay? So when, for example, Turkish foreign policy changed in 2007, and we started to use economic integration tools. We eliminated tariffs with Iraq. We eliminated visas between Turkey, Syria, Turkey, Yemen, Turkey, Libya, Turkey, Georgia, Turkey, Azerbaijan, Turkey, Russia, okay, which enables increased people flow between the two countries. When Turkey turned to Iraq and began to invest heavily in Iraqi politics and economics, when Turkey started to have an open zone with Syria in 2008-2009 in economics, Turkey was using soft power. Okay? It was using tools that have economics in their origin rather than military power in its dealings with Syria, Libya, Iran, Iraq, what have you. Okay? So Keohane and I say, in international politics, military capabilities, yes, of course they matter, but only form a relatively small aspect of the picture. Okay, I'm going to come to Alican. Second, let's say, basket of tools under soft power are diplomatic. Okay, what is diplomatic? In the Turkish case, Israeli government interferes in a flotilla, and Turkish citizens die. What does Turkey do? It does not declare war on Israel. It does not use limited force against Israel. It goes to the United Nations. Okay? Turkish foreign minister goes to the United Nations, asks the Security Council to investigate the issue and to basically put together a resolution condemning Israeli action. Okay? So That's a diplomatic tool. In the same fashion, okay, Turkish government goes to the United Nations and asks for a resolution on Syria. Okay? So economic and diplomatic tools are soft power tools. Alican? Very good question. So why would economic sanctions not be understood within the realist paradigm, right? Because, or as part of hard power, it's not it's not the possibility of threat. You can threaten diplomatically as well. Okay, so it's not the usage of threat. You can say, this is what we have done. You can threaten Israel saying, I will go to the court of justice or the world court for a condemnation. That's also a threat. But you use the threat through diplomacy. You use the threat through economic means. That makes it separate from a hard power threat. A hard power threat will say, I will use force unless you perform this action. Okay? So economic tools, of course, precisely because they also feed into hard power. The more economic power you have, the more military capabilities you would have. They would be, you could see them, sharing elements of both hard and soft power. Okay? But economic threats, economic sanctions don't carry the possibility of use of force. Unless you say, I will, and this is what actually, United States have done on Iran. Unless you say, first, I will use economic sanctions, okay? So first, I will adopt an embargo on your oil and gas, okay? And if you still don't conform, well, I will consider use of force. That's a combination of hard and soft power, okay? So there is a possible, and it's actually, constantly occurs in international politics. We actually see US mostly, not the EU, combining hard and soft power elements. Okay? And now in the last couple of years, okay, have begun to, in 2011, he began to actually argue that it's not necessarily hard and soft power that matters, but a combination of them. And your soft power, that is your ability to induce change through economic measures, will be very weak unless you also have hard power backing you up. So unless you have significant military capabilities in the background, okay, what you threaten other countries to do, diplomatically and economically, would not matter. Okay? And this he called smart power. Okay? So it's a combination of hard and soft power. You need to have military capabilities backing you up in order for your economic tools to have credibility. So unless you have the possibility of using force in case Iran does not conform to your wishes on nuclear non-proliferation, your economic sanctions would not work either. Okay? So, but this was not the argument they made in mid-1970s. Okay? But what matters, again, theoretically, is this. The emphasis on soft power, the emphasis on economics and diplomatics in 1975 began to contest the realist paradigm by demonstrating another angle, another aspect of international politics that realists did not consider. Okay? So we see a strengthening, an emphasis of the liberal arguments that economic ties matter. Diplomatic networks. Okay? The world has become, over the past 50 years, an interdependent world. What is interdependence? They define it very, very simply. The existence of multiple ties and networks that brings all the states together. The UN is an example of interdependence. The fact that the Western European countries and the US depended on the Middle East for oil, therefore their economic production, is interdependence. The fact that you have these multiple economic ties that are built through trade and foreign direct investment is interdependence. So they argue that, as long as there are these multiple economic ties, as long as there is an extensive volume of trade between the US, Western Europe, and let's say Latin America, their ability to resolve the conflicts among themselves through hard power capabilities decrease. Okay? So the higher the economic ties, the lower the probability of a conflict being resolved through war. So instead of stressing one's military strength, okay, one's significant military power, Keohane and Nye argue that there are other tools that will make war less likely. Okay? So it's not that wars happen because there is nothing to prevent them, like Kenneth Waltz. You could actually prevent wars by building these interdependent ties. Okay? The higher the economic interactions, the lower the probability of having war, which I'll come later on. So hard versus soft power. Okay? Nye. 2 years ago, Nye came up with a combination of that through smart power. Okay? During the Iraqi war of 2003, okay, when the United States decided to intervene in Iraq in 2002, we actually see rounds of discussions within the UN among the European countries as to the extent to which this is an acceptable action and whether they would participate or not. Now, in that time period, a couple of people began to actually compare and contrast the European and the American ways of foreign policy and their role in international politics. Robert Kagan is one of them. Okay? It's actually, he has multiple books. This one is very, very easy to read. It's titled Power and Paradise in International Politics. And Kagan basically argues that Americans are from Mars and Europeans are from Venus. Okay? There is this very famous Mars and Venus books for men and women relationships. So Kagan takes it and says, well, Americans operate and formulate foreign policy in an Hobbesian world. Okay? So the starting assumption in American foreign policy is Hobbes, which is, okay, it's every man is against another man. The world is filled with selfish utility maximizer individuals, and the only way to survive is to increase your military strength as much as possible. Whereas he argues that the Europeans come from Venus, and they actually come from a Kantian world. Okay? So we actually see, and these are the two philosophies behind these two different paradigms. Realism is the Hobbesian tradition. I have talked about this in the first week, and liberalism comes from the Kantian tradition. Okay? So Kagan says the reason why the Americans and the Europeans see differently on the issue of Iraq in 2003 is because the Americans tend to view the world in a zero-sum game where any increase in power in other players such as Iraq would constitute a contestation or a decrease in the American power, and the proper response. Okay? It's not only how you view the world, but how you formulate a proper response, and the proper response to deal with that rests with military power, rests with use of force. Okay? So the Americans don't hesitate, okay, to use force if they perceive a conflict of interest, whereas the Europeans, since they come from, or they operate from a Kantian tradition, according to Kagan, they use alternative methods. There is a problem in Iraq. Instead of direct use of force, the Europeans emphasize, let's first use the United Nations. Okay? Let's first go to the UN and discuss this within the Security Council, diplomacy. Okay? Or they say, well, we don't want Iraq to build nuclear weapons or weapons of mass destruction. Let's not automatically use force from Iraq or Iran, for that matter, from doing that. Let's use economic sanctions. Let's put an embargo on Iraq and not allow Iraq to trade freely in the international markets. So even if they might perceive the same problem, but again, the perceptions will change accordingly, but even if they perceive the same problem, that is, even if the Americans and the Europeans would agree on, let's say, Iraq being a common problem, the appropriate measures that they would like to take in response to deal with that problem differ significantly. Okay? And that's because the US tradition comes from a realpolitik tradition, according to Kagan, so they would emphasize use of force. Okay? Whereas Europeans, now that they have these 50 years of integration behind them, have built a more or less Kantian world, they would like to use alternative tools. So power, US, paradise, Europe, basically, okay? Now, these are two different views of the world, which then shapes what kind of measures you would like to take, okay? Similarly, it doesn't have to be different countries, okay? You can actually use the same argument to see how, you know, there are diverging preferences within the states themselves on how to deal with a security problem, okay? So those who stress hard power, okay? Hunger strikes, let's crush the hunger strikes, okay? Palestinian uprising, let's crush the Palestinian uprising, okay? So Israel, for example, is a more realpolitik origin, you know, focused state. So there is a problem they confront in the West Bank and Gaza, crush it, okay? Use of force, okay? If, you know, there are other more liberal groups in Israel who say, well, you know, there is an ongoing problem with Palestine, maybe we should start a dialogue, okay? So force versus dialogue, hard, soft, okay? Hobbes, Kant, okay? Depending upon which assumption you operate from, the tools you will adopt to deal with that specific problem will differ, okay? You can apply that exactly into what is happening around you today as well. So liberalism then. To tie back this to the liberal paradigm, starts with a different assumption than the realist paradigm, okay? Remember, realists assume that human nature is by definition not improvable, okay? It cannot change. Human beings are evil, selfish, what have you. That's not necessarily enough as itself bad, because there's no such thing as good and bad. It's just a starting assumption, okay? So Hobbesian assumption, human nature is by definition not improvable. Therefore, if you want to have order from the Hobbesian tradition, what do you need? You need the Leviathan, okay? Exactly, like Aslanur said, hegemony. You need the Leviathan. So what we discussed on Tuesday and last Thursday, the hegemonic power that we are discussing in international politics, you can think of that as the Leviathan in Hobbes, okay? There is no central authority, therefore an hegemonic power rises and places the rules. Thou shalt not do this, okay? That's a rule. And then the Leviathan also says, if you commit a certain action that violates that rule, I will use force against you, okay? So it changes the cost benefits for that actor with respect to certain actions. Kant, on the other hand, comes from a different tradition, okay? So what is it that Kant says? Very good. The Age of Enlightenment, okay? The Age of Enlightenment and the emphasis on reason that precedes Kant enables Kant to argue that human nature could be improvable. It's not by definition unimprovable, but it's by, you know, it's by its nature could change. So you don't need to have a Leviathan basically managing human beings, but they could actually develop certain systems and structures among themselves, certain institutions, okay, that will enable them to behave in a certain way, okay. Family is an institution, of course, okay. Society is an institution. Political organization, governments are institutions. So Kant says there are certain types of structures that emerges in human interactions which enable them to have, you know, more peaceful relations without necessarily resorting to force. Okay? Kant's main argument is his emphasis on the role of democracy. Okay, so from Kant's point of view, the whole Kantian tradition gives you in international politics the emphasis on political regimes as the key to understand state behavior. So Kant argues that democracies have specific ways of resolving conflict among themselves. Therefore, in a world characterized by democracies, if all the countries were democracies, they would not actually use force. So Kant places in contrast to Hobbes, which ties back to how I began this on Tuesday, the outcomes that takes place at the international level, not as a function of the structure, so wars happen, there is nothing to prevent them, outcome, war, is a function of the structure. Kant says, well, we can prevent wars if we have democracies, so he sees outcomes as a function of unit level variables, okay? And that's a key difference from Hobbesian and the Kantian tradition as well. So pluralism / liberalism, okay, ties itself to the Kantian tradition for the set of assumptions that it gives you. Okay? Human nature is by definition improvable. It's a starting assumption, which then tells you that through the creation of certain institutions, you could actually change human behavior. Okay? And not only you can change human behavior, because Hobbes also tells you can change human behavior. Okay? From Hobbesian tradition, if there is a Leviathan, you will not commit certain actions. Okay? That's a change in human behavior. But Kant says not only you can change human behavior, you could actually also improve and change human nature, which is constant in Hobbes. Okay? So that's one, therefore, and this is also one of the reasons why you could see realism is more deterministic and pessimistic, whereas there is a higher degree of choice in liberalism, in Kantian tradition. Okay? And the emphasis is on, in liberalism, is on the individual. Okay? Whereas from the realist perspective, the emphasis, or the main focus is on the structure. So if it's a structure-agent issue, okay, realism gives you a more emphasis on structure. Liberalism gives you the emphasis on the agent. Okay? Who is the agent? The individual. Who is the agent? The state. Who are the agents? The foreign policy makers. Okay? They have an element of choice. Okay? They can do voluntary actions. Whereas specifically in structural / neorealism, this doesn't exist. Are you tired? Okay, so what are the assumptions from liberalism? States are not unitary, okay? That's a key argument. And this is actually the reason why I have written these like that. These are direct contestations of the realist assumptions. States are not unitary basically changes states are unitary assumption from realism. States are not unitary means states are made up of sub-state actors, different social groups, okay, different bureaucracies, all of which have possibly diverging preferences. So states are not unitary contests or changes the realist argument that there is a national self-interest, okay, which would remain constant from one government to the other, from one political group to the other. So states are not unitary means you cannot basically formulate, and this ties back to the second one, a rational actor model. You cannot expect the state to act as an individual, as a rational actor. That doesn't mean states are not rational. That doesn't mean that rationality assumption is changing. But under liberalism, we see a limitation, okay, bounded rationality.